The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad to stand here today to address our Rental Fairness and Affordability Act that addresses a need that this government has failed to respond to, and that is the need to limit increases on rents in Nova Scotia. The purpose of this bill is to provide meaningful action on the affordability crisis that plagues the Nova Scotia housing market and that is appearing at our constituency offices with frightening frequency and regularity. The Rental Fairness and Affordability Act would do several very important things to protect renters in Nova Scotia. It sets the base rent as that which was in effect for the previous tenant, thereby preventing unrestrained rent increases when a new tenant moves into a unit. It would tie the annual allowable increases in rent to the lowest of the following three measures: 2.5%, the Nova Scotia Consumer Price Index rate, or a lower limit set by Cabinet. And importantly, it would allow for a 0.8% rent increase in its first year in effect. These measures would inject some desperately needed balance into the rental market. The Rental Fairness and Affordability Act does allow for rent increases beyond those thresholds, but only in particular circumstances. Rents can be increased by up to 3% above the base limit, where a landlord has done or undertakes to do renovations or add services. Landlords can still apply to allow greater increases if there are exceptional increases in property taxes, utilities, or other expenses. These measures would allow clarity, security, and some important peace of mind to the thousands of renters across the province who are unsure day to day, month to month, whether they will be pushed out of their homes by rent increases that they can't afford. The bill puts forward important measures to protect renters in Nova Scotia, where unpredictable and unsustainable rents have had an outsized impact on families and communities. We, in our constituency offices, are hearing constantly from people who are struggling to either find housing or who are being faced with eviction or unsustainable rent increases. To share one illustrative anecdote, we've heard from the Nova Scotia Community College that several students at their waterfront campus in Dartmouth were accepted into programs at the college and were forced to decline after a long search for housing that they could afford. And they did not find that housing. We hear constantly of tenants being served with colossal rent increases that effectively serve as eviction notices. I'll note that we also, in my constituency office, now advise people who contact us to do everything possible to remain where they currently are, even if the housing that they are in is inadequate, even if there is conflict or some other circumstance which would normally cause them to move. We're saying, no, stay where you are, because we can't undertake to help you find a new place to live. We're just simply not finding units, and nor housing support workers who the Premier or the Minister referenced earlier today during question period. Often a tactic of a significant rent increase is used by landlords who want to turn the unit into a short-term rental, Airbnb. I'd say that across Halifax, but also in Bedeque, also in Lunenburg, also in parts of other parts of Cape Breton and places that are attractive for tourists. People are doing calculations to see how they're going to do better. And that is frankly playing havoc with people's right to housing. And other times it's simply used if the landlord believes that the market has changed enough that they can maybe find a tenant who is able or willing to pay more for the unit. And it's not hard for the members of this House, even if they haven't had those sorts of constituents in their own offices, to imagine the impact that this kind of dynamic has on a labor market that is skilled for hungry workers. And something that I was until recently unaware of, and which all members of this House may not know, is that we actually have rent control legislation in Nova Scotia already. It was in force in the province until 1993, when it was quietly removed by the then Liberal government through an order in council, exempting all residential premises from the Act. Our Residential Fairness and Affordability Act brings back this important protection, but also strengthens it. And for the 122,645 households that rent in Nova Scotia, this legislation would make a significant and immediate difference for them. There is much evidence that it is needed. According to 2016 data, 23,645 households in Nova Scotia spend more than 50% of their income on rent and utilities. 30% is considered a manageable threshold. In the federal riding of Halifax alone, there are 6,440 households that spend more than 50% of their income on rent and utilities. That is a whopping 25%, a full quarter of the riding that is faced with this unsustainable, stressful reality in their day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month budgeting. And you know, on a day when many members have spoken about mental health and the importance of mental health, I can tell you I have been approached in the grocery store by constituents who are suffering from deteriorating mental health as a result of precarious housing that they are afraid that they will lose due to the dynamic that is happening in the rental market. Restrictions on unreasonable rent increases would make an important difference for people in the riding of Halifax, where 40% of residents are renters. And this is a higher proportion of renters compared to other cities in Canada. For instance, in Calgary, only 28% of households are renters. Nova Scotia sits above the national average for household spending over 30%. Over the national average for household spending more than 30% on their rent and utilities. Which is the threshold, again, which is seen as manageable for households. And that means that more people here in Nova Scotia are paying too much of their income on housing than the average across the country. According to housing experts, these numbers indicate that Nova Scotians are facing an unsustainable housing situation. And we have learned from data in the 2018 Canadian Rental Housing Index that the Nova Scotia rental market is actually the fourth least healthy in Canada. And if I can find the right piece of paper, I will table that, but I might do it after I finish speaking. Families in this province are regularly in the position where they have to choose between housing themselves or buying food and clothing. And they're often in a position where they have to forego other things that they might want to purchase for their families, such as vacations or extra classes for their kids. Despite extensive construction in the last number of years in Halifax, which has helped the rental situation to some extent, building is not keeping up with demand and not in the section of the market that is badly needed. Between 2014 and 2017, 5,000 new units came onto the market in Halifax and filled significant demand for largely higher rent units. And I would note that in buildings that are older, it has seemed that the construction of new units has actually facilitated modest renovations of older buildings followed by dramatic increases in rents. In fact, rents have spiked by 19% during the same period, greatly outpacing the rise in incomes. And housing intended for workers that is affordable for people with middle and lower incomes has not increased. All these dynamics together are resulting in renters being pushed out of their homes and in some cases pushed out of their communities. And we hear stories from people experiencing this on a daily basis. in my constituency recently, I was contacted by a constituent who works full-time at a hospital as a porter in a unionized position, and she lives in an older apartment building in a bachelor. She doesn't have a car. She's able to walk or to take the bus to work. And that building has not been significantly refurbished or improved, but it's surrounded by newer apartment buildings. You know, she's given up all the extras, and with the rent increase that she is expecting in January, one full paycheck a month will go to her rent. And on the phone, we went through different options that are available to her to, you know, look at living somewhere that would still be in the community which she has called home for decades, where she would not be so stressed by her rent payment. And the only option that I could come up with to suggest was Northwood, where you know, she can get on a wait list for independent living for an apartment. But the question that I was left really pondering after that phone call was, if a full-time unionized worker is lining up for below market housing provided by a nonprofit organization like Northwood, what hope is there for people who are, you know, working in the gig economy and don't have the protections of a union, for people on income assistance, for people on disability, for people who are retired and living on a fixed pension, and for all the other Nova Scotians who are in a yet more precarious situation than that constituent who was truly stressed by her housing situation. We know that rent supplements, which the government often speaks of, are not working for those for those people who are so lucky as to be assigned one because of the extremely low vacancy rate. In fact, we were contacted by somebody fairly recently who, you know, with his rent supplement was looking and not finding even a basement apartment, even, you know, in a different community, in a much longer commute away from where all of his social contacts are, all of his family are. And in this environment where really all the power is with landlords because of the low vacancy rate, it is increasingly difficult to convince a landlord to even consider taking a rent supplement. There is a certain amount of paperwork involved. There's a certain amount of wait time where a unit might be vacant, and they've got people lining up. And today I heard about an 8-page application that people are asked to provide to apply for an apartment. So in that sort of circumstance where renters are already, you know, being forced to accept high rents, being forced to really make all kinds of concessions to find a place to live, there's no reason for a landlord to work with the province and accept those rent supplements. And that's quite apart from the fact that I hear concerns about whether Metro Regional Housing has the necessary staff working to even assign and process rent supplements. So for all these reasons, it is abundantly clear that we need real action on rental affordability. And our Rental Fairness and Affordability Act is a meaningful step in this direction. And so I encourage all of my colleagues in this House to consider supporting it. And I thank you very much.